The class was told to build a weapon. Human snapped a chair leg and called it a spear. The obsidian tiles of the training hall did not register the weight of intent until the wood cracked. It was a clean, dry sound that cut straight through the low hum of 6 different electronic weapon systems. The fracture line traveled 4 inches up the grain of the front support leg, exposing raw, unpainted pine fibers that smelled faintly of friction heat and old industrial lacquer. Jason McCree did not look up when the wood gave way. He kept his calloused thumbs pressed against the base of the seam, applying steady lateral pressure until the joint separated with a second, smaller pop. To his left, the 3 other members of his assigned triad sat perfectly still. Their iridescent scales had gone a flat, heavy gray, a biological reaction to an unexpected sound that their automated scanning arrays could not immediately categorize. The training room held 47 elite cadets from 3 separate sovereign systems, each tasked with a simple institutional mandate. They had been given exactly 60 minutes to construct a lethal implement using only the raw materials present inside the training pavilion boundaries. The title of the exercise on the center display read clearly, Local Resource Procurement Phase 1. To the alien cadre, the task was an evaluation of high-grade technical assembly. The Silvics had already spent 20 minutes channeling local electrokinetic fields into a shimmering plasma blade that crackled with blue stasis arcs. The Qumari had stripped the reinforced alloy plating from the instructor's backup bench, using their rear limbs to fuse the metal into a 300-pound kinetic hammerhead. Everyone had an apparatus. Everyone had a proprietary network connection. Jason McCree had a broken piece of a standard utility seat. The wood composite was 11 inches long, thick enough to fit inside a human palm and entirely devoid of internal wiring or energy cells. He turned the fragment over twice, his calloused knuckles catching the harsh white glare of the overhead ion-filtered lights. He did not look at the other cadets. He did not check the countdown timer on the wall. He simply lowered the broken end to the ceramic tile beneath his boots and began to scrape. The sound was terrible. It was a flat, rhythmic rasp of organic fiber grinding against a high-density ceramic surface, back and forth, completely unhurried. I wish I could tell you the Academy understood what that sound meant. They didn't. Stay close because the part that still keeps the directorate awake at night happened much later. The rasping continued for 4 minutes without a shift in tempo. Across the second tier of the pavilion, Kalensiv adjusted the containment field on his plasma blade, the blue light reflecting off his forward sensory ridges. His species did not use physical impacts. They used the precise application of thermal energy to dissolve targets at the molecular level. To him, the human was merely damaging property. The internal surveillance network logged the action as an anomalous maintenance deviation, but it did not flag it as a threat. The human had no energy signature. The human had no neural sync activity. Jason stopped scraping when the jagged white splinters at the tip had flattened into a sharp, 4-sided wedge. It was crude, heavy, and structurally primitive, but the point was narrow enough to find the seam of a standard infantry uniform. He stood up slowly, his movements loose, keeping the stick pointed at the deck plates. His thumb tested the edge. A small bead of red fluid formed against the callus, but his expression did not shift. He did not look proud. He looked like a man who had finished a routine chore behind a barn. He walked toward the rear of the pavilion where the primary test apparatus stood. The target dummy was a massive non-biological block constructed from high-density plastic steel alloy, specifically rated to survive direct impacts from heavy thermal ordnance and biochemical corrosive agents. The Qumari's alloy hammer had left a 3-inch scuff on its shoulder plate earlier in the session, but the dummy's structural integrity register still read at absolute capacity. Jason stopped 3 paces from the block. He did not balance the weapon like a javelin. He did not drop into a traditional martial stance. He simply shifted his weight to his rear heel, locked his wrist, and hurled the piece of wood. The thud was loud enough to vibrate the floor tiles. The 11-inch wedge of pine buried itself nearly 5 inches deep into the center of the dummy's chest plate. The internal framework of the machine groaned, the indicator lights along its flanks flickering twice before settling into a steady yellow error state. The wood did not shatter. It had entered at an exact 45-degree angle, wedging itself between the primary compression plates. The training hall went completely silent. It was the kind of heavy, pressurized quiet that smelled of ozone and recycled air. Kalensiv stepped down from the second tier, his 4 arms flexing in sequence as he approached the dummy. He did not look at Jason. He looked at the piece of furniture protruding from the alloy chest. He gripped the pine shaft with his primary upper limbs and pulled. The wood did not move. He shifted his stance, bringing his lower pair of arms down to gain leverage against the dummy's frame, his scales shifting to a dark, agitated violet. He pulled until the joint housings in his shoulders emitted a dry click. "It will not come out," Kalensiv said, his vocal cords clicking through the translator. "The core has locked around the entry point." "It splintered on impact," Jason said. His voice was flat, entirely conversational. "The angles are wrong. If you pull it straight, the barbs catch the inner plate. You'll have to cut the metal open to get your dummy back." Instructor Veilshorn walked forward from the central dais. His 8-foot frame cast a long, slanting shadow across the obsidian tiles. He did not touch the wood. He tapped his data pad 3 times, his long, tail-mounted sensory fibers twitching against the floor. He logged the entry under a new classification code, one that the Academy's strategic system had not used in 84 years. "Note," Veilshorn said to the room's recording node, "the human asset does not require industrial production chains to establish an anti-armor baseline. Anything within the perimeter can be converted into a lethal tool within 4 minutes." Jason shrugged, turning back toward his row. "Back home, we call it a spear. Kids make them out of fence posts when they're bored." The evaluation period ended 20 minutes later, but no one moved to clear the dummy. The cadets left the hall in small, silent groups, their advanced energy cells humming softly as they passed the display case. The piece of pine remained there, sticking out from the plastic steel chest like an intentional insult. Later that evening, well past the institutional curfew, Witness Node 12 tracked a small illumination signature inside dormitory corridor. C. Jason McCree sat on the edge of his bunk, his bare feet resting on the cold metal floor. He was humming a low, repetitive tune from the western plains of his home continent. In his right hand, he held a standard, unaugmented steel cup. He was slow scraping the edge of his bunk frame, removing the lacquer line by line, his movements identical to the work he had performed on the training floor. The surveillance drone hovered 6 inches from the plexiglass window, its optical shutter fluttering as it recorded the data. The human was not preparing for a tactical deployment. He was simply passing the time, but the system flagged the behavior as a structural hazard. The next morning, a generic bulletin appeared on the primary cadet hub. It contained 3 lines of automated text. Notice 41. Unauthorized modification of institutional furniture is strictly prohibited. Financial penalties will apply to all sovereign quarters found in violation. No names were appended to the document, but when Jason entered the mess hall, the 3 cadets at the front table immediately lowered their nutrient bowls. They did not speak, but their forward eyes tracked his limp as he walked toward the water unit. The dynamic had cracked. The elite lines of the Academy were built on the certainty of technological superiority, the absolute belief that a warrior was only as formidable as the network behind him. The stick in the dummy had introduced an unquantifiable variable. It wasn't an item on an invoice. It couldn't be remote disabled by a system override. By midweek, the instructor announced the first live terrain team exercise. The notification arrived via neural drop, but Jason read his from a handheld slate that required 2 manual thumb presses to scroll. "We are forming triads," Veilshorn announced from the platform, his scales a rigid, formal green. "You will not choose your units. In a live theater, you fight with the assets that survive the initial insertion." Jason was assigned to a group with Yakai, the Talon biowielder, and a heavyset Kumari cadet named Thern. Neither alien looked at him during the initial briefing. Thern was busy checking the calibration on his kinetic shock gloves, the heavy alloy plates clicking against his thick carapacial ridges. Yakai sat with his arms crossed, his vine symbiote coiled tightly around his left wrist, its green toxin sacs pulsing in a slow, defensive rhythm. "The scenario is a standard breach within Sector 9, the instructor continued. "The environment is nonlinear. Synthetic bulkheads, variable illumination, active noise traps. Your objective is the recovery of a tactical beacon at the center of the maze. You will use standard training batons only. High-energy output is restricted for this phase." The batons were soft, black plastic rods designed to register tagged contact on the uniform sensors without causing tissue damage. Jason held his by the base, testing the balance. It was too light, the center of gravity floating 3 inches above the grip, but he did not complain. He tucked it into his belt loop and looked at his partners. "Stick close," Jason said as the pneumatic doors of the simulation chamber hissed open. "Don't wait for your sensor arrays to tell you where the walls are. Watch the floor plates. If the dust is clear, someone's been through recently." Thern let out a short, wet rattle from his vocal tract. "My lenses track thermal footprints up to 40 minutes old, human. I do not need to look at dust." "Suit yourself," Jason said. They entered the maze at a steady trot. The air inside smelled of stale ozone and dry grease. The synthetic bulkheads were a dull, flat gray, crowding the corridors until the space felt like the interior of a transport hull. Jason moved differently than the aliens. He didn't drop into a tactical crouch, and he didn't check his wrist console every 4 paces. He kept his head up, his ears tuned to the low, distant scraping of the other teams moving through the parallel channels. At the third intersection, the lights cut out completely. The darkness was total, the kind of absolute black that made the eyes strain against the silence. Thermal dampeners are active, Vern hissed, his heavy boots clattering against the metal floor as he lost his orientation. My lenses are blind, the sync is dropped. Quiet, Jason whispered. His hand reached out in the dark, finding the rough edge of Vern's carapacial plate and pulling the massive cadet back against the bulkhead. They're above us. A sharp hiss cut through the air from the ceiling section. It wasn't an energy weapon, it was the sound of feathers catching a cross-draft. The feathered cadet from the El-Carry team was dropped from the ceiling grid, her talons outstretched to clear the immediate perimeter. She did not use a baton. Her species relied on the descending weight of their lower skeletal frame to pin a target before applying an electronic tag. Jason did not swing the plastic training rod. He dropped beneath the angle of the glide, his shoulder catching the El-Carry cadet right where her primary wing joints met the breastplate. The impact sent a dull shudder through his ribs, but the momentum was entirely on his side. He drove his weight forward, slamming her back into the synthetic bulkhead with a hard, unyielding crunch. Her sensor vest flashed red once, signaling an immediate operational disconnect. To his right, the darkness broke into a sudden flurry of blue sparks. Kalen Siv's triad had found Yakai. The Talon biowielder was backed into a corner, his vine symbiote spitting rapid, wet pulses of paint markers that lit up the corridor walls in brief neon streaks. But the electrokinetic units were closing the distance, their short-range batons crackling with compressed stasis fields that hummed at a pitch high enough to make the teeth ache. Vern tried to pivot his massive frame to assist, but his heavy boots caught the edge of a floor plate, his carapace scraping against the wall as he stumbled. Jason didn't check on them. He scrambled toward a loose utility hatch that had been left slightly unbolted by the maintenance cadre. His fingers dug into the recessed handle, his forearms straining until the metal seal tore away with a sharp screech. He didn't use it defensively. He lifted the 20-pound steel panel with both hands, waited for the next charging cadet to clear the corner, and hurled it like a flat stone across a pond. The metal disc caught the leading Silvix cadet square in the center of his upper chest array. The impact threw the alien backward 3 yards into his own squadmates, their weapons tangling as they fell in a heap of discharging energy grids. Before the second unit could recalibrate their sensors, Jason closed the gap on foot. He didn't use form. He used the blunt end of his plastic baton to tag both targets before they could scramble off the deck. The simulation clock stopped 3 seconds later. The overhead lights flickered back to a harsh, default white, exposing the gray dust that had been kicked up during the scuffle. The debriefing room at the Obsidian tier was silent when the triad entered. Instructor Veilshorn sat behind the main console, his iridescent scales fixed in a cold, rigid pattern that signaled maximum observation. On the secondary screen, the replay data was looped at a quarter speed. The system did not track the tactical elegance of the Silvix or the biological precision of the Talon. It tracked a gray rectangle, the human moving through the black without an active neural interface. The instructor did not look at the scoreboard. He stared at the data column listing the resource efficiency metrics. The human asset utilized an unsecured structural element to neutralize an entire advanced kinetic cell, Veilshorn said aloud, his tail fibers completely still against the deck. He did not calculate the energy reserve of his issued arm. He changed the geometry of the corridor by removing the hatch. Kalen Siv's forward ridges twitched with a deep, systemic agitation. It was an unaugmented impact. The rules specified standard training rods. The use of building material violates the simulation structure. The simulation mimics a theater of war, the instructor replied, his voice dropping into a register that made the translation modules click rapidly. A theater of war has no maintenance schedule. The human did not look for a weapon on his belt, he looked for a weight in the room. This was the exact moment the institution's primary certainty began to fray. For 44 semesters, the directorate had operated on a singular mathematical calculation. The group with the highest technological sync speed wins the engagement. Jason McCree sat on the bench, his thumb tracing a fresh tear in his sleeve, entirely unconcerned with the philosophy on the dais. He had survived 3 winters on an unmapped border world with nothing but a hatchet and a box of salt. To him, an academy maze wasn't a tactical puzzle, it was just a strange house with too many doors. "The score stands," Veilshorn announced, his scales shifting to an iron gray that none of the cadets had seen before. "But the survival value is listed as anomalous. McCree, report to the medical ward for an internal scan. The impact on the bulkhead registered above your recommended safety threshold." Jason stood up, his side tightening as the adrenaline began to drain from his skin. "Just a bruise." Vern's backstep caught me before the lights came on. The medbay was a long, sterile gallery that smelled of cold iodine and the sharp mineral bite of ion-filtered air. The scanning frame traveled twice from his heels to his chin, its blue light reflecting off the gray uniform fabric. The medical technician, a detached, three-eyed unit from the outer rim, stared at the display for a long time without speaking. "The third intercostal space shows a clear structural strain," the technician said, pointing a thin finger at the screen. "And a deep tissue hematoma is forming along the right lateral margin. You will require 5 days of cellular reconstruction therapy." "I'll take a wrap and a cold pack," Jason said, pulling his shirt down over the purple-tinted skin. "The cells can fix themselves on their own time." "The manual requires immediate intervention for non-augmented species," the technician countered, his middle eye fluttering in disapproval. "Your recovery timeline without synthesis is inefficient." "I've got a seminar tomorrow," Jason said, stepping off the platform with a small, careful grunt. "The wrap is enough." He walked back to his quarters using the rear service stairs to avoid the main pavilion traffic. The side of his chest burned with every third breath, a dull, localized ache that made his pace slower than usual. When he reached the corridor, he found Yakai waiting near the entryway door. The Talon's Vine symbiote was small now, coiled into a protective knot beneath his uniform sleeve, its green sacs dim and quiet. "You left the maze before the database could sync your profile," Yakai said, his feathered crest low and tight. "The others are saying you used an illegal kinetic override." "I used a piece of iron," Jason said, leaning his hip against the door frame to take the pressure off his ribs. The bolts were loose. "We are taught that the tool is an extension of the nervous system," the Talon continued, his eyes tracking the stiff line of Jason's shoulders. "If the sync is broken, the warrior is dead, but you had no sync, you were simply angry." "I wasn't angry," Jason said, his voice dropping into a low, even rhythm. "I was just out of time. If I waited for that baton to register, your friend with the scales would have had me pinned. You don't need a nervous system to understand how 20 pounds of steel acts when you throw it." Yakai stood in the dark corridor for several minutes after Jason entered his room. The human did not turn on the main overhead illumination. He used a small, low-powered desk light that left the corners of the space in deep shadow. From the hallway, the sound began again, the slow, rhythmic rasp of wood scraping against metal. Jason sat on the edge of his mattress, his compression wrapped tight against his ribs. In his lap was a short, unhoned length of timber he had pulled from the underside of his storage locker earlier in the semester. He wasn't shaping a spear this time, he was merely cleaning the edges, smoothing the rough grain until the material felt balance in his hand. The next morning, the structural reality of the academy shifted again. A field notification appeared on the primary display screens across all 4 training sectors, but it didn't list a rule change or a point adjustment. It was an institutional reassignment notice for the mid-semester evaluation phase. "The upcoming drill will take place within the Rixus range," Veilshorn announced as the cadre gathered at the transport docks. "No simulations, no training batons, you will be deployed in open terrain with live tracking units. Your objective is the recovery of an unshielded core payload from an ancient automated station." The Rixus Range was a collection of fractured basalt cliffs and steep volcanic crevices that sat under a low-gravity pocket on the northern continent. The winds there were constant, a thin, freezing draft that carried the scent of old ash and mineral dust. The team assignments were kept identical to the maze exercise. Jason stood at the edge of the transport ramp, his boots sinking 2 inches into the loose black gravel. His side still twitched when the wind caught him, but he had cinched the compression wrap until the skin beneath was numb. Beside him, Mirai, the feathered Elkari cadet he had slammed into the bulkhead 3 days prior, was flaring her wings to test the thermal drafts coming off the lower crevice lines. "The low-gravity pockets are unstable," she said, her voice carrying a sharp, bird-like edge. "If you drop into a crevice here, your mass won't save you. The wind will trap you between the stones before you reach the floor." Then let's stay on the high ground, Jason said, checking the manual latch on his survival pack. The scout drones were already visible above the peaks, tiny, black triangles that moved in precise, geometric grids across the gray sky. The training cells had exactly 40 minutes to cross the first ridgeline before the automated perimeter sensors went active. Vosh, the Danaki scout who had been assigned to lead their forward navigation line, dropped into a low run, his cold-blooded limbs moving with a silent reptilian economy across the loose stone. Mirai followed with short, lifting hops, her feathers catching the freezing air as she cleared the smaller fissures. Jason ran point on the gravel, his boots making a heavy, crunching sequence that sounded entirely too loud in the wide silence of the range. They were halfway to the station when the basalt plate beneath Jason's right boot gave way without a click. It wasn't a slow break. The volcanic shelf had been hollowed out by centuries of thermal gas vents, leaving nothing but a 2-inch crust of hardened ash over a 30-foot vertical drop. He didn't have time to reach for a line, and his uniform had no emergency thruster units to arrest the descent. He simply vanished from the ridgeline in a sudden cloud of black dust and splintered stone. The impact at the bottom of the crevice was absolute. The low gravity reduced the ultimate force, but the narrow stone walls caught him twice on the way down, pivoting his frame until his left leg struck the floor at a sharp, unnatural angle. Jason lay perfectly still on the cold basalt floor, the breath driven completely from his lungs. For 60 seconds, the only sound in the deep slot was the tiny, frantic clicking of his manual slate against his belt buckle. The darkness inside the crevice was deep, lit only by a thin, slanting gray ribbon of sky 30 feet above. Jason, Mirai's voice crackled through the short-range comms link, her tone distorted by the mineral interference of the volcanic walls. Jason, do you copy? The tracking signature is fluctuating. He tried to answer, but his throat was full of dry ash and the metallic taste of a split lip. He rolled onto his side, his left ankle emitting a sickening, grinding sensation that made the skin on his forehead go instantly wet with cold sweat. His right wrist throbbed with a rhythmic, heavy pulse that signaled a clean hairline fracture across the small bone. Still breathing, he rasped into the collar mic, his voice thin and rough. Left leg is out of the rotation, wrist is cracked. Hold position, Vashi's voice cut in from the ridge. We are deploying the anchor lines. The drone grid will clear our sector in 11 minutes. Jason looked up at the narrow ribbon of light. The walls of the crevice were slick, covered in a greasy layer of old volcanic soot that offered no natural handholds for an unaugmented grip. But from the darkness further down the slot, a low, mechanical hum began to vibrate through the stone floor plates. The automated station's defensive perimeter wasn't just tracking the peaks, it was resetting from the bottom up. The mechanical hum from the lower floor plates grew louder, changing from a dull vibration into a sharp, metallic whine. A line of crimson light split the dark at the far end of the slot, tracking along the rock face as the station's defensive system initialized its secondary sensor sweeping cycle. The scanner didn't search for organic signatures. It calibrated against physical movement within the trench boundaries, prepared to discharge short-range kinetic pulses at anything that crossed its path. Jason McCree did not call for the anchor lines a second time. He knew the wind drafts along the upper ridge would keep his team from deploying the cables before the red beam completed its sweep. His left hand slid down to his survival pouch, his fingers ignoring the sharp throb in his cracked wrist as he pulled out a roll of braided nylon cordage. He had to secure the joint before the machine reached his position, or the first involuntary reflex would drive the bone straight through the skin. He crawled back toward the rusted surveillance post he had noticed when he first struck the floor. The structure was ancient, a vertical pipe of raw iron that had been anchored into the basalt during the initial survey phase, its outer panels now thin and brittle from decades of chemical corrosion. He reached up with his uninjured hand, gripped the top of the signal antenna, and pulled with a short, heavy jerk. Metal snapped with a wet click. It was a hollow rod less than an inch thick, but the fracture left two distinct pieces with clean, straight margins. Jason laid them flat against his left boot, using his thumb to verify the alignment against his outer ankle bone. He didn't look up at the ribbon of gray sky, and he didn't check the progress of the scanning line. He wrapped the braided nylon around the iron rods, pulling the cord with his teeth until the knots sank deep into the fabric of his boot. The pain was a cold weight that made his vision go narrow at the edges, but when he stood up, the splint held. He could pivot on the right heel, using the braced left leg like a wooden post to maintain his balance against the slope. Above him, the sound of loose gravel signaled Vosh's attempt to reach the lip of the crevice. McCree, the sensor grid is locking our position from the peak. We have to clear the ridge or the transport loop will reset our team score to 0. Go for the payload, Jason shouted into his collar, his palms flat against the wet basalt wall as he began his first upward step. I'm already out of the tactical formation. If you drop down here, we lose the sector before we see the station. The manual forbids unit abandonment during a live tracking phase, the Danaki scout countered, his voice rising against the wind. The manual doesn't have a broken ankle, Jason said. Move your cell. The line went quiet. Jason didn't wait for a confirmation beat. He reached for a narrow horizontal fissure 3 inches above his forehead, his bleeding fingers digging into the volcanic soot until his nails touched raw stone. He hauled his mass upward, using the braced left leg to jam into the vertical cracks for leverage, his right wrist screaming every time his weight shifted to the right side. It was a slow, mechanical ascent that had no relation to the fluid martial forms taught in the main pavilion. He didn't look for safety handles. He looked for the sharpest edges, the rough basalt teeth that could bite into the leather of his boots and hold despite the low-gravity drafts. Every yard cost him 4 minutes of physical exertion, his gray uniform turning a dark, grease-stained black as he dragged his torso against the soot-covered rock. He reached the first intermediate ledge 40 minutes later. The space was a narrow shelf of volcanic ash, barely wide enough for a human seat, but it sat 3 feet above the path of the defensive scanning beam. The crimson light rolled beneath his dangling boots, its electronic eye clicking twice as it registered the empty rock floor before continuing its loop toward the lower tunnel network. Jason leaned his head against the basalt, his breath coming in dry, rattling gasps that tasted of iron and pulverized stone. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the manual slate, and cleared the flashing alert screen with 2 heavy thumb presses. The strategic display showed his team's position. Vosh and Mirai had reached the outer perimeter of the automated station, their icons moving through the first defensive ring at a pace that suggested heavy environmental resistance. But from the far side of the ridge, a second set of indicators began to populate the screen. A triad from the Silvix cadre had cleared the parallel channel, their advanced kinetic units moving toward the payload sector without any signs of structural delay. Jason watched the digital lines converge. If his squad took the time to secure the core while the Silvix held the high ground, the resulting crossfire simulation would pin them against the vault doors. His team needed a distraction, something loud enough to draw the automated perimeter sensors away from the main transport docks. He looked down at the iron rod he had used for his splint. The lower end had been ground flat by his climb, the metal bright and silver against the black gravel. He didn't unwrap the nylon cord. He reached down, unbuckled his survival pack, and pulled out his standard-issue magnesium fire starter, the small, unaugmented block he had used to dry his boots during the border world deployments. He didn't strike the flint. He began to shave the silver metal onto the dry lacquer of his utility slate, his movements slow and rhythmic despite the low drone of the station's defensive grid. The silence on the ledge lasted for 3 minutes. Then, from the corridor behind his position, a heavy footstep caused the loose ash to slide over the lip. It wasn't a drone. Instructor Veilshorn stood at the turn of the crevice, his 8-foot frame wedged tightly between the volcanic walls, his iridescent scales reflecting the red glow of the passing sensor beam. He didn't have his data pad out and his tail fibers were tucked close against his leg armor. The tracking system logged your disconnect 40 minutes ago, Cadet, the instructor said, his translator clicking through the dark slot. By all institutional metrics, you are a localized casualty. Why are you altering your gear on an unmapped shelf? Jason didn't look up from his slate. The metrics assume that when a leg stops working, the asset stops moving. I'm just correcting the balance. You have no ammunition, Veilshorn continued, his forward eye ridges narrowing as he watched the pile of magnesium shavings grow. Your squad is 70 yards ahead and the Silvix hold the entry gate. What do you expect to achieve with a handful of grease and a broken rod? I'm going to make a phone call, Jason said, his voice dropping into a flat Western drawl, and I don't need a network link to do it. He finished the shaving line, folded the slate in half to contain the metal powder, and slid his body back toward the lip of the ledge. His calloused fingers gripped the edge of the rock, his braced legs swinging clear of the shelf as he prepared to drop back into the path of the red scanner. The instructor didn't reach out to arrest the movement. He simply watched, his scales shifting to that same iron gray that had marked his posture in the debriefing pavilion. This was the cliff where the old academy logic failed entirely. The system was designed to evaluate perfection, the seamless integration of biological potential and high-grade military hardware. It had no subroutines for a non-augmented unit who treated bone damage as a temporary calibration error and an ancient surveillance post as a supply depot. Jason dropped 5 feet, his boots striking the floor with a heavy, uncushioned thud that made his teeth click together. The red scanning beam reversed its cycle instantly, its internal relays clicking as it locked onto the sudden mass deviation at the base of the trench. He didn't run, he couldn't. He stood his ground in the center of the slot, took the folded utility slate in his right hand and struck the magnesium block with his manual knife blade. The white flash was absolute. It wasn't the controlled thermal bloom of a plasma blade. It was a raw chemical glare that filled the narrow crevice with a blinding magnesium smoke that smelled of burning oil and sulfur. The automated station's sensor eye, calibrated to track low-intensity thermal footprints, was blinded instantly by the sudden energy spike, its internal logic circuits registering a catastrophic core breach within the sector boundaries. The sirens across the Rixus range began to wail a second later, a high mechanical scream that echoed off the basalt peaks like an ancient war horn. Up on the ridge, the Silvix triad froze mid-advance, their electronic visors whirring as they tried to parse the sudden smoke column rising from the crevice. The automated defense drones left the main vault gates in a single, rapid swarm, their navigation loops resetting to counter the suspected explosion at the base of the mountain. Jason leaned his back against the wet stone wall, the white smoke curling around his gray uniform as he watched the sky clear of the black triangles. His collar mic crackled once, Vosh's voice breaking through the static with an unexpected clarity. "The gate is open, McCree. The drones are clearing the perimeter. We have the payload." "Then get to the transport docks," Jason said, his hand reaching down to check the nylon wrap on his ankle. "The smoke's going to clear in 4 minutes and I don't think the instructor wants to wait around for a second flash." He began his crawl toward the transport exit, his braced leg dragging a shallow trench through the loose black gravel behind him. He didn't look back to see if Veilshorn was following. He didn't need to. The sound of the instructor's heavy boots was already audible through the stone plates, a slow, deliberate sequence that matched the rhythm of his own uneven steps. By the time the transport shuttle cleared the Rixus sector, the sky had turned a dark, bruised purple. The 3 members of the triad sat in the rear bay, their gray uniforms covered in a uniform layer of volcanic ash that made their species marks look faint and distant. Theron sat with his kinetic gloves unlinked, his massive head lowered toward the deck plates. Yakai was quiet, his vine symbiote resting in a shallow cup of water he had pulled from the medical kit. Jason sat across from them, his left boot removed to allow the medical technician to apply the standard compression wrap. The swelling had turned the skin of his ankle a deep, mottled green and yellow, but his face remained flat, his fingers holding the iron rod he had carried up from the crevice. "You violated 3 distinct parameters of the deployment," the technician said, his middle eye fluttering with a high-frequency alarm. "The use of chemical agents without an institutional clearance code is a structural violation." "The agent was an issue fire starter," Jason said, his voice conversational. "It's on page 40 of the inventory ledger. If the machine can't handle a spark, you shouldn't leave the furniture where it can catch fire." The shuttle touched down at the main pavilion docks 10 minutes later. The rest of the Academy cadre was already lined up on the obsidian tiles, their weapons held at a formal presentation angle as the instructor walked down the transport ramp. Veilshorn didn't return to the central dais. He stopped at the edge of the first tier, his long tail fibers twitching once against the floor plates before he turned his gaze toward the display case. The 11-inch piece of pine from the first week was still there, embedded in the plastic steel dummy, its grain white and clean under the ion lights. "The evaluation phase is complete," Veilshorn announced to the quiet room, his scales shifting through 3 separate patterns of gray before locking into a flat, unpolished black. "The final score will not be adjusted by point totals. The performance of the human cell has demonstrated that our current tracking parameters are insufficient to measure baseline survival risk." He tapped his data pad once, deleting the 40-semester calibration profile from the main Academy hub. "From this day," the instructor continued, "the utility units within the pavilion will be replaced with solid-state alloy fixtures. No wood composite will be permitted within 3 sectors of the training environment." Jason smirked, his calloused thumb tracing the edge of the iron rod in his lap. "You can change the seats, sir, but you're still going to have to teach them how to count the brakes." The change out of the training materials did not occur before the sunset. Workers from the logistics cell arrived with heavy motorized crates, their mechanical lifters grinding against the pavilion doors as they began unbolting the tiered benches. They worked under the glare of 3 yellow maintenance beacons, their long, segmented limbs moving with the efficiency of factory components. They were not replacing parts, they were clearing an infection. Jason McCree sat on the lowest step of the outer arcade, his gray uniform shirt unbuttoned to the middle to let the dry night wind hit the fresh compression wrap around his ribs. His left boot rested on the gravel, the iron rod from the Rixus range crevice lying across his right knee like a stray piece of scrap from a forge. He didn't offer to help the logistics cell, and they didn't look at his corner. Across the courtyard, Mirai was standing under the shadow of the Arboretum dome, her primary wing feathers tucked flat against her sides. She had been assigned to file the post-deployment ammunition report, a 3-page data log that usually took 4 minutes to upload through the neural sync. But her console was dark. She was turning a loose piece of volcanic basalt over and over in her palms, her claws scraping the rough stone until a fine gray dust settled over her boots. She walked toward the arcade after the workers loaded the first crate of composite seats. "The directorate has flagged your survival file for an institutional tracking sweep," she said, her voice dropping below the rattle of the transport loaders. "They are running a calculation on your home world's irregular deployment records. They want to know how many more like you are registered in the regional draft." Jason picked up a small pebble from the gravel between his heels. "There are about 30,000 in my district alone. Most of them are better shots than I am." "The system cannot index that figure against our current readiness models," Mirai said. Her crest feathers tightened into a rigid vertical line. 30,000 unaugmented assets with no network infrastructure means the regional theater remains completely uncalibrated. If the border drops, the directorate cannot issue an override. "That's the point of a border," Jason said, his thumb tracing the rough grain of the stone. "You don't override it, you just hold it." He stood up, his ankle giving a tiny, muffled click as he shifted his weight to the heel. He didn't look for a crutch. He walked past her toward the mess hall pavilion, his uneven stride leaving 2 distinct patterns in the dust, a flat, deep boot print on the right, and a narrow, dragged line where the iron splint had altered his left heel angle. The interior of the commons was different now. The standard utility tables had already been removed, replaced by cold, solid-state alloy fixtures that had been bolted directly into the foundation pillars. The metal was smooth, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the white iron lights in long, clinical bars. There were no edges. There were no seams. The material had been treated with an anti-abrasive coat that resisted manual tool modifications. The cadets sat in the center row, their nutrient bowls resting on the alloy plates without a sound. Yakai was 3 seats back from the service unit. His Vine symbiote coiled tightly around his wrist like a dead green wire. He wasn't tracking the network updates on his slate. He was watching the third table where a heavy-set Kumari cadet was using a broken piece of an alloy file to score the underside of his personal storage kit. The scrape was slow, rhythmic, and completely quiet, the exact sequence Jason had used on the ceramic floor during the first week of the evaluation. Jason sat down at the end of the bench, his fingers unwrapping a cold ration brick from its plastic lining. He didn't speak to the cadre and he didn't check the console on the wall. Instructor Veilshorn entered the commons 10 minutes later, his 8-foot frame casting a wide shadow across the metal floor. He didn't carry his datapad and his long tail-mounted sensory fibers were dry, covered in a light layer of gray basalt soot from the transport docks. He stopped before the central table, his forward eye ridges scanning the rows of quiet cadets until his gaze locked on the human's gray shirt. "The Academy roster has been updated," Veilshorn announced, his vocal cords clicking behind the translation unit. "The mid-semester rotation will be suspended for 2 days. The tactical cell will remain within the perimeter to complete a manual assessment of mechanical resource stability." The room remained still. No one checked their neural drops for the announcement. "The directorate has issued a new manual parameter," the instructor continued, his scales shifting to an unpolished, deep charcoal color. "Every cell will submit 1 raw physical implement before the next deployment phase. The tool must be fabricated without the use of an energy core, a plasma edge, or a network link." Kalen Siv stood up from the second row, his 4 arms flexing in a sequence that suggested a structural protest. "The directive changes the evaluation standard. Our lineages are measured by our compatibility with high-grade kinetic arrays. A primitive fabrication requirement drops our sector score below the competitive margin." "The margin is already gone," Veilshorn said. His voice dropped into a register that made the translation modules emit a steady, high-pitched error tone. The human-driven stick in the center dummy has stayed fixed for 9 days. The logistics crew tried to cut the frame away this morning. The blade broke. He stepped toward the wall display, his long claw touching the interface to load the final structural update. The core of the machine did not lock because of a system command, the instructor said, his eyes tracking the lines of data. The wood absorbed the moisture from the hydraulic seal. It swelled inside the plate. The calculation was wrong because the calculation didn't account for how a dead plant behaves when it gets wet. The silence in the commons was absolute. It was the same heavy, ozone-scented quiet that had filled the pavilion after the first throw. Jason McCree did not look up from his ration brick. He chewed the dry paste slowly, his thumbs quiet against the edge of the alloy table. He had known about the hydraulic seal since the third day. His father had spent 20 years repairing timber dams on a river that rose 3 feet every spring. He didn't tell the instructor, and he didn't check the reaction on the Silvix cadet's face. He stood up when the dish cleared, his hand reaching down to pick up his gray service cap from the bench slat. He walked out of the pavilion alone, his uneven boots making a slow, rhythmic crunch across the gravel yard as he headed back toward the dormitory block. The display case at the entrance of the main pavilion was finished by midnight. It was a heavy, 3-sided box constructed from reinforced plexiglass, bolted directly into the obsidian foundation tiles right between the tactical trophy arrays and the ancient achievement medallions of the High Directorate. The 11-inch piece of pine was inside. It wasn't cleaned. The rough, jagged bark was still covered in the yellow grease of the target dummy's hydraulic core, the splinters white and sharp under the small, focused spotlights. The placard beneath the glass didn't have an institutional serial number, and it didn't list a competitive score. The text was short, hand-etched into a strip of raw iron by an unaugmented tool, improvised, effective, human. Jason stopped before the case on his way to the morning assembly, his hands tucked into his uniform pockets, his shoulders loose against the white light. He didn't touch the glass and he didn't read the text aloud. He simply looked at the grain of the wood for 3 seconds, verifying that the 4-sided wedge had held its shape despite the dry lacquer of the display environment. Above him, the surveillance drone hovered 4 inches from the ceiling grid, its optical shutter fluttering in a fast, erratic sequence as it tried to log the human's physical stance. The network was clear. The data columns were balanced, but from the dormitory halls behind the pavilion, the sound was already rising again through the ventilation shafts, the slow, deliberate rasp of 40 different metal files grinding against the edges of the new alloy chairs. Jason turned his back to the case, his uneven boots finding the line of the gravel path as he walked toward the outer ridge. The wind from the northern peaks was still freezing, carrying the distant, bitter tang of old ash and mineral dust across the stones. He didn't look back at the display box and he didn't check his manual slate for a signal. He kept his head down, his thumbs hooked into the faded seams of his gray belt, his steps slow and steady against the slope of the mountain. The iron rod in his hand was cold, the edges sharp enough to cut the skin if the grip slipped in the dark. He didn't drop it. He carried the weight with him into the next sector, his boots leaving a single deep mark in the loose black gravel before the wind cleared the ridge.